Her name was Sophie Miller, and her world was about to shatter. In the gilded cage of New York's most exclusive restaurant, a single deliberate act of cruelty would see her fired, humiliated, and cast out onto the cold city streets. She thought she had lost everything, but what she didn't know was that a silent observer had watched the entire scene unfold. A reclusive billionaire, a man haunted by a ghost from his past. As she was thrown out, a small silver pendant swung free, and the billionaire's world stopped. He froze, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. That pendant, it wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a key to a secret buried for 2 decades, a tragedy that had defined his life and a truth that would change hers forever. The Gilded Sparrow wasn't just a restaurant. It was a theater. Every night, a performance of wealth and status played out across its damask-draped tables. The clinking of crystal was the applause. The hushed whispers of the city's elite were the script, and the staff were the silent, invisible stagehands. Among them, almost translucent in her crisp black and white uniform, was Sophie Miller. At 24, Sophie moved with a practiced grace that belied the ache in her feet and the anxiety simmering just beneath her calm exterior. For 2 years, she had navigated the treacherous currents of the Gilded Sparrow, mastering the art of being present but unnoticed. She could recite the vintage of every wine on their ridiculously long list, describe the esoteric ingredients in Chef Antoine's latest deconstructed fantasy, and, most importantly, she could smile, a genuine warm smile, even when her world felt like it was crumbling. The smile was for her grandmother, Eleanor, whose image was tacked to the inside of her locker. Eleanor, with her fading blue eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis, was the reason Sophie endured this nightly performance. The bills for the modest but clean nursing home upstate were a relentless tide, and Sophie's meager salary, supplemented by the often paltry tips from clientele who thought a $10 bill for a $1,000 meal was generous, was the only seawall she had. Her other source of strength hung from a thin silver chain around her neck, always tucked safely beneath her uniform. It was a pendant, a simple, weighty locket shaped like a phoenix, its wings intricately carved, its surface worn smooth by the touch of 3 generations of women. It was the only thing she had of her mother, a woman she'd never known, who had passed away when Sophie was an infant. "It's a Miller heirloom," Eleanor had told her, pressing it into her hand on her 16th birthday. "It represents our strength, our ability to rise from the ashes." "Never forget that, Sophie." Tonight, the ashes felt particularly close. The air in the restaurant was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the humidity outside. It radiated from one man, Mr. Peterson, the restaurant manager. He was a man whose ambition had long since curdled into petty tyranny. He prowled the floor like a shark in a tailored suit, his eyes missing no detail, his lips permanently pursed in a state of preemptive disapproval. He thrived on fear, and tonight he seemed particularly hungry. "Miller," he'd hissed at her earlier during lineup. "Table 7, the Blackwoods. Do not, and I mean do not, get anything wrong." Victoria Blackwood would complain if she were served liquid gold. Sophie knew the name. Victoria Blackwood was a regular, a woman sculpted by wealth and entitlement, whose husband's real estate empire had bought her a permanent seat at the top of the city's social ladder. She treated the staff less like people and more like inconvenient furniture that occasionally spoke. As Sophie approached table 7, she plastered on her best smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Blackwood, Mr. Blackwood. May I get you started with some water for the table? Perhaps a bottle of the San Pellegrino?" Victoria didn't even look at her. She was scrolling through her phone, her diamond bracelet catching the light and scattering painful little stars across the tablecloth. "Whatever," she said, the word clipped and dismissive. The evening progressed as a masterclass in passive aggression. The water was tepid. The bread was not as fresh as last time. The amuse-bouche was an uninspired choice. With each complaint, Sophie would nod, apologize sincerely, and glide away to rectify the non-existent issue, feeling Mr. Peterson's gaze burning into her back from across the room. She was a tightrope walker, and Victoria Blackwood was gleefully shaking the rope. The main courses arrived. Sophie placed the seared scallops before Mrs. Blackwood with the delicacy of a bomb disposal expert. She was just turning to serve Mr. Blackwood his steak when it happened. With a movement that was both languid and shockingly fast, Victoria swung her arm out, ostensibly to gesture at something across the room. Her hand connected squarely with Sophie's wrist. The bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux, a $2,000 bottle they had insisted on having decanted at the table, tilted. A river of deep crimson liquid sluiced from the decanter, cascading directly onto the lap of Victoria Blackwood's pristine, cream-colored silk dress. A collective gasp rippled through the nearby tables. Time seemed to slow down. Sophie saw the dark stain blossom on the expensive fabric. She saw the slow, malicious smile that touched Victoria's lips before it was replaced by a theatrical mask of horror. "Oh my God!" Victoria shrieked, jumping to her feet. The performance had begun. "Look what you've done! You clumsy, incompetent girl! This dress is ruined! It's couture!" Mr. Blackwood, a man who seemed perpetually exhausted by his wife's dramatics, simply sighed and rubbed his temples. But it was too late. Mr. Peterson was already swooping in, his face a mask of apoplectic fury. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, his voice carrying across the now silent dining room. "Your waitress just assaulted me," Victoria cried, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Sophie. "She was careless. She threw this wine all over me." Sophie stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Blackwood, but your arm, you hit my hand," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you calling my wife a liar?" Mr. Peterson snarled, his face inches from hers. He didn't care about the truth. He cared about the $2,000 bottle of wine and the high-profile customer. Sophie was collateral damage. "No, sir, You're fired," he spat, the words like venomous darts. "You are fired. Get your things and get out of my restaurant. Now!" The humiliation was a physical blow. Every eye in the restaurant was on her. She saw pity in some, scorn in others, and cold indifference in most. Victoria Blackwood watched with an air of smug victory, dabbing at the stain with a napkin as if it were a mortal wound. "But my paycheck," Sophie whispered, thinking of Eleanor. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to you, minus the cost of one silk couture dress and one bottle of Chateau Margaux. You'll be lucky if you get anything at all," Peterson said, his voice low and menacing. "Now get out before I call security and have you thrown out." Tears blurred her vision. She turned and walked, each step an eternity. She didn't look at the other diners, at the staff who quickly averted their eyes, afraid of being tainted by her failure. She walked past the kitchen, past the locker room, and straight out the heavy oak doors into the cool night air. The sounds of the city, the blaring horns, the distant sirens, were a jarring contrast to the suffocating silence of her own shock. She leaned against the cold brick of the building, the uniform suddenly feeling like a costume of shame. Her hand instinctively went to her neck, her fingers closing around the familiar, cool metal of the phoenix pendant beneath the fabric. She pulled it out, its silver form a small, solid comfort in the palm of her hand. She stared at it, the tears she'd held back finally streaming down her cheeks, blurring the image of the rising bird. She had lost her job. She had lost her dignity. She had no idea how she would pay for Eleanor's care. The ashes were no longer just close. They were swirling all around her, threatening to choke her. She clutched the phoenix tighter, a silent, desperate prayer for the strength it was supposed to represent. From a secluded corner booth where shadows clung like velvet, Alexander Croft had watched the entire, sordid spectacle. He was a man who had cultivated invisibility as a fine art. At 45, with a fortune so vast it was spoken of in abstractions, he had retreated from a world that wanted to consume him. His presence at the Gilded Sparrow was a rare anomaly, a concession to a potential business partner who had insisted on the venue. The partner had canceled at the last minute, but Alexander, finding a strange solace in the anonymity of the crowd, had decided to stay. He was a ghost at the feast, his dark, impeccably tailored suit and quiet demeanor allowing him to blend into the opulent background. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, missed nothing. He had seen the waitress, Sophie, from the moment she'd approached her difficult table. He'd noted her quiet competence, the gentle patience in her posture as she absorbed the relentless stream of petty complaints from the woman in cream silk. He recognized the type. New money, loud and insecure, using cruelty as a currency to prove their worth. He saw the accident for exactly what it was. He was seated at the perfect angle. He saw Victoria Blackwood's arm extend, a deliberate, calculated strike. He saw the flicker of malice in her eyes before the performance of outrage began. He saw the manager, Peterson, a pathetic sycophant, immediately sacrifice the powerless girl to appease the wealthy patron. It was a disgusting, commonplace tableau of power dynamics, the kind of casual cruelty that confirmed Alexander's low opinion of humanity. Normally, he would have done nothing. Getting involved was messy, and Alexander Croft avoided messes. His life was a fortress built to keep the world and its chaotic emotions at a distance. He would have simply paid his bill, slipped out a side entrance, and forgotten the girl's face by the time his car reached the Tribeca penthouse that served as his hermitage. But then something happened that broke through his fortress walls. As the manager publicly humiliated her, as the girl turned to leave, her shoulders slumped in defeat, the force of her movement caused the thin silver chain around her neck to swing out from under the collar of her uniform. For a single heart-stopping moment, the pendant caught the light of the chandelier. A phoenix, a silver phoenix with intricately carved wings, its design so specific, so achingly familiar, that the air rushed from Alexander's lungs. The silver fork in his hand clattered onto the china plate with a sharp crack that went unnoticed amidst the dining room's low hum. His blood ran cold. The world around him, the clinking glasses, the murmur of conversation, the scent of expensive food, all of it dissolved into a roaring static in his ears. It couldn't be. It was a ghost made of silver and memory that he had buried 22 years ago, along with his heart. He felt a compulsion so strong it was a physical force, an invisible hand pushing him from his seat. This was not a mess to be avoided. This was a cosmic anomaly, a rip in the fabric of his carefully ordered reality. He threw a sheaf of $100 bills onto the table, far more than enough to cover his untouched meal, and stood up, his movements stiff, his stormy eyes locked on the exit the waitress had just disappeared through. He strode across the restaurant, his usual stealth forgotten. A few diners looked up, recognizing the famously reclusive billionaire, their eyes widening in surprise. He ignored them. He pushed past the maitre d' who started to greet him, his focus absolute. He burst out onto the street, the humid August air thick in his throat. He scanned the crowded sidewalk. For a terrifying second, he thought he'd lost her. Then he saw her, a small, forlorn figure huddled on a stone bench in a small pocket park across the street, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For the first time in years, Alexander Croft felt a tremor of something other than grief or detached cynicism. It was a terrifying, fragile thing. Hope. He crossed the street, his expensive leather shoes silent on the pavement. He approached her cautiously, as one might approach a frightened deer. He was a man accustomed to command, to having his presence immediately acknowledged and deferred to. Now he felt clumsy, an intruder on her private grief. Sophie didn't notice him until his shadow fell over her. She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and wary. She saw a tall man, handsome in a severe, brooding way. He was dressed in a suit that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. She instantly recoiled, assuming he was another one of them, another member of the elite class that had just crushed her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice raspy. Alexander's own voice was rough from disuse. He cleared his throat. "I was in the restaurant," he began, his tone softer than he intended. "I saw what happened. It was unjust." Sophie stared at him, suspicion hardening her features. "Okay, so what?" He gestured, a slightly awkward movement of his hand. The necklace you're holding," he said, his gaze fixed on the silver phoenix clutched in her fist. "The pendant. May I ask where you got it?" The question was so bizarre, so out of place, that it momentarily stunned her out of her misery. "Why?" she asked, her hand instinctively tightening around the heirloom. "It's none of your business." "Please," Alexander said, and the word was raw, stripped of all artifice. It held a universe of pleading. "It's more important than you can possibly imagine. I need to know." Sophie looked from his face, a mask of desperate, restrained intensity, down to the pendant in her hand. It was just a piece of old silver, her only link to a dead mother and a struggling grandmother. What could it possibly mean to this stranger, this man who looked like he owned the entire city? Unsettled and confused, she slowly, hesitantly uncurled her fingers, revealing the phoenix resting in her tear-stained palm. Alexander's breath hitched. He took an involuntary step closer, his eyes devouring the details of the carving, the curve of the wings, the tiny, almost invisible sapphire chip that served as the bird's eye. It was identical. It was the one. "My God," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's really it." The air in the small park was thick with the scent of damp earth and city exhaust. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, creating an island of intimacy around the bench where two worlds had collided. Sophie stared at the stranger, this imposing man whose composure had utterly shattered at the sight of her family's locket. His reaction was too raw, too genuine to be a trick. Confusion warred with her grief and suspicion. "I don't understand," she said, her voice still shaky. "It's just an old piece of jewelry. My grandmother gave it to me." "Your grandmother," Alexander repeated, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He finally seemed to regain some measure of control, pulling his gaze away from the pendant to look at her, truly look at her, for the first time. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the determined set of her jaw even in her distress. He saw strength. "Miss... I'm sorry, I don't know your name." "Sophie. Sophie Miller." "Sophie," he said, testing the name. He sat down on the other end of the bench, a respectful distance away. The movement was deliberate, an attempt to appear less threatening. "My name is Alexander Croft." The name meant nothing to Sophie. She didn't read society pages or business journals. He was just a rich man in a suit who was acting strangely. "Okay, Alexander Croft. Why are you so interested in my pendant?" Alexander looked away, his gaze settling on the distant, glittering skyline of a city he had conquered but never felt a part of. He began to speak, his voice low and measured, as if recounting a story he had told himself 1,000,000 times in the dead of night. 22 years ago, I had a sister. Her name was Lillian. The name was a ghost on his lips, barely a whisper. She was 7 years younger than me, all light and laughter. She was my whole world. Our mother, she was an artist, a designer. Before she passed away, she created 2 pendants. They were identical. He paused, swallowing hard against a grief that was still as sharp as broken glass. She called them the Phoenix pendants. They were for Lillian and me, a matching pair. Our mother told us they were a symbol of our family, of the Croft bond, that no matter what happened, we could rise from any tragedy as long as we had each other. A phoenix for a Croft. Sophie listened, captivated in spite of herself. The story resonated with what her own grandmother had told her, the words echoing across the decades. Rise from the ashes. When Lillian was 16, Alexander continued, his voice growing tight, there was an accident. We were on a family trip, sailing off the coast of Maine. A sudden squall, a terrible storm. The boat capsized. I was pulled from the water. My father too. But Lillian, she was lost. They searched for days. They found pieces of the wreckage, but they never found her. She was wearing her pendant that day. He finally turned back to look at Sophie, his stormy eyes filled with a pain so profound it was breathtaking. They declared her gone. We held a memorial, but I never believed it. In my heart, I felt she was still out there somewhere. For years, I searched. I hired investigators, followed dead-end leads. It nearly destroyed my father. It nearly destroyed me. Eventually, I had to accept it. I had to let her go. He leaned forward, his hands clasped between his knees, his gaze locking onto hers with searing intensity. That pendant you are holding, it is not just like the one my sister had. I am certain it is the one she had. The sapphire chip for the eye. It was a last-minute addition by our mother. Only our family knew about it. There is no other one like it in the world. Sophie's mind reeled. The story was fantastical. The plot of a movie. Not something that happened on a park bench in New York City after the worst night of your life. That's impossible, she breathed, shaking her head. This was my mother's. Her name was Sarah. Sarah Miller. She died when I was born. My grandmother, Eleanor, raised me after my father passed a few years later. It's been in our family. Your mother, Sarah, Alexander said, his mind racing, connecting dots that had been scattered for 2 decades. What do you know about her? Before she met your father? Sophie frowned, trying to recall the fragmented stories Eleanor had told her. Not much. Grandma said my dad, Robert, found her. She'd had some kind of accident. Couldn't remember anything about her past. Amnesia. They fell in love. He was a simple man, a carpenter. They didn't have much, but they were happy. She never regained her memory of the time before she met him. The pendant was the only thing she had from her past life. Amnesia. The word hung in the air between them, charged with unbelievable possibility. A 16-year-old girl, washed ashore after a boating accident, her memory wiped clean. Found by a kind man. Given a new name, a new life. It was a fragile, gossamer thread of a theory, but it was the first real thread Alexander had been able to grasp in 22 years. Sophie, he said, his voice thick with emotion, I know this sounds insane. I know I'm a stranger and you have every reason to distrust me, but I believe your mother, Sarah, was my sister, Lillian Croft. The statement was so immense, so life-altering, that Sophie couldn't process it. Her life was defined by its smallness, her tiny apartment, her dwindling bank account, her love for her grandmother. This man was talking about a world of lost heiresses and family secrets, a world she had no place in. No, she said, pulling back, clutching the pendant to her chest as if it could shield her. No, you're wrong. You're mistaken. My mother was Sarah Miller. I'm Sophie Miller. I'm nobody. You are not nobody, Alexander said, his voice firm, cutting through her panic. Look at me, Sophie. I have spent half my life mourning a ghost. For the first time, I have a reason to believe she was real, that she lived, that she had you. His expression softened. If I am right, that doesn't make you nobody. It makes you my niece. The word niece hung between them, terrifying and wonderful. Sophie looked from his earnest, pained face to the silver phoenix, the symbol of resilience, the symbol of rising from the ashes. Her grandmother's words, his mother's words. Coincidence? Or was it fate, a secret that had been patiently waiting in the dark for a single shocking moment of recognition? Her tears had stopped. Her shock was now a maelstrom of confusion, fear, and a tiny flickering spark of something she hadn't dared to feel all night. Curiosity. What if he was right? What if her entire identity, the simple, hard-scrabble story of her life, was just the final chapter of a much grander, more tragic tale? My grandmother, Sophie whispered, the realization dawning on her. If this is true, she would know. She would have to know. Alexander nodded, his expression grimly determined. Yes, she would, and we need to talk to her. The next 48 hours were a blur for Sophie. Alexander Croft moved with the speed and efficiency of a man for whom obstacles were merely temporary inconveniences. The chasm between her world and his was thrown into stark relief. One moment she was a destitute, unemployed waitress. The next she was a passenger in a silent, impossibly luxurious black sedan, the city lights sliding past the tinted windows like a dream. Alexander didn't take her back to her cramped, walk-up apartment. Instead, he had his driver take them to a 5-star hotel suite that was larger than her entire floor. You'll be safe here, he'd said simply, handing her a keycard. My security will be downstairs. No one will bother you. He also provided her with a new phone and a credit card with an astronomical limit, which she stared at as if it were an alien artifact. For essentials, he'd explained, seeing her hesitation. I'll have some clothes sent over. He introduced her to a man named Mr. Reynolds, his head of security. Reynolds was a quiet, imposing figure with watchful eyes and an air of absolute competence. He spoke to Sophie with a respectful deference that she found deeply unnerving. He was the one who, with a few quiet phone calls, arranged everything. The nursing home is called Maple Creek Senior Living, Reynolds reported to Alexander the next morning in the suite's sprawling living room. It's about a 3-hour drive upstate. I've spoken to the administration. They're expecting us. I've also arranged for a top geriatric specialist from Lenox Hill to meet us there, to ensure Mrs. Miller is not put under any undue stress. Sophie, dressed in a simple but elegant cashmere sweater and trousers that had appeared in the closet overnight, felt a pang of guilt. She's fine, she's just tired. We don't need a specialist. Alexander gave her a gentle look. It's a precaution, Sophie. The truth, whatever it is, might be a shock for her. I want to make sure she is cared for in the best possible way, no matter what. His concern was so genuine, so comprehensive, it left her speechless. This man was prepared to move mountains for a possibility, for a ghost story sparked by a silver pendant. The drive upstate was quiet. Sophie stared out the window at the city dissolving into suburbs, then into the lush, green landscapes of upstate New York. Alexander sat beside her, lost in his own thoughts, his face a tight mask of anticipation and dread. What if they were wrong? What if this was all a wild goose chase, a cruel coincidence that would only reopen old wounds for both of them? Maple Creek was pleasant enough, a clean, modern facility with well-tended gardens. But to Sophie, it had always represented her failure to care for Eleanor herself. As they walked down the quiet, antiseptic-smelling hallway, her heart began to pound. She was about to confront her grandmother, the bedrock of her life, with a story that could shatter everything they had. They found Eleanor sitting in a worn armchair by the window in her small room, a half-finished knitted blanket in her lap. Her face lit up when she saw Sophie. "Sophie, darling, what a wonderful surprise," she said, her voice thin but warm. Her eyes, clouded with age, then fell upon the tall, imposing man standing behind her granddaughter. She stiffened, a flicker of alarm in her expression. "Who is this?" "Grandma, this is a friend. Alexander Croft," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. She knelt by her grandmother's chair. "We need to talk to you about something. It's important." Alexander gave a slight nod to the doctor who had accompanied them, who waited discreetly by the door. He then pulled up a chair, his movements slow and deliberate. "Mrs. Miller," Alexander began, his voice soft. "My name is Alexander Croft. I apologize for intruding like this, but I believe we may have a shared history that neither of us was aware of until recently." Eleanor's gaze darted from Alexander's serious face to Sophie's anxious one. She clutched the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. "I don't know what you mean." Sophie took a deep breath and pulled the phoenix pendant from under her sweater, letting it rest in her open palm. "Grandma, it's about this. It's about Mom." Eleanor's eyes fixed on the pendant. The color drained from her face. Her cheerful demeanor evaporated, replaced by a deep, ancient fear. She looked like a woman staring at a ghost. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, though she already knew the answer. "You gave it to me," Sophie said gently. "You told me it was a Miller heirloom. But Mr. Croft, he knows it. He says it belonged to his sister, a sister who was lost at sea 22 years ago, a sister named Lillian." Eleanor began to tremble. A tear escaped from the corner of her eye and traced a path through the wrinkles on her cheek. "No," she breathed. "It can't be. After all this time, please, Mrs. Miller," Alexander pleaded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Eleanor, I have to know. Sophie told me her mother, Sarah, had amnesia, that she had this pendant and nothing else. Was it her? Was Sarah my sister?" The dam of secrets, built over 2 decades to protect the girl she loved, finally broke. Sobs racked Eleanor's small frame. Sophie wrapped her arms around her, holding her tight. "I'm so sorry, Sophie," Eleanor wept, her words muffled against Sophie's shoulder. "I'm so sorry. I only ever wanted to protect you." After the doctor had given her a mild sedative and she had regained some composure, Eleanor told them the story. She spoke in fits and starts, her gaze distant as she journeyed back in time. Her son Robert was a kind, simple man who worked as a carpenter in a small coastal town in Maine. One morning, after a brutal storm, he'd been walking the beach and found her. A young girl, barely 16, unconscious, battered and half drowned, tangled in a fishing net that had washed ashore. She had no identification. When she awoke in the small local clinic, she couldn't remember her name, her family, or how she got there. The only thing she possessed was the silver phoenix pendant around her neck. They called her Jane Doe. With no one to claim her and her memory gone, the system was ready to swallow her whole. But Robert felt a profound connection to the lost, frightened girl. He visited her every day. When she was released, he and Eleanor took her in. They gave her a new name, Sarah. She was so lost, Eleanor whispered, twisting a loose thread on her blanket. But she was sweet. She and Robert, they fell in love. It was a pure and simple love. We were her family. This simple life, it was safe. I saw the pendant, of course. It was clearly expensive, not something a simple family would own. I suspected she came from wealth, from a different world. But that world had lost her, hadn't it? It had let a storm take her. I thought we were giving her a better life, a safer one. When Sarah became pregnant with Sophie, she grew weaker. The doctors couldn't explain it. She passed away shortly after giving birth. Robert was devastated, and he passed away from a heart attack just a few years later, leaving Sophie in Eleanor's care. I kept the secret, Eleanor said, looking at Alexander, her eyes pleading for understanding. I was afraid that her old family, if they ever found out, would take Sophie away from me. She was all I had left of my son, and I was afraid of that other world, a world with accidents and lost girls. I wanted to keep her safe in our world. Silence filled the room, thick with the weight of unearthed truth. Sophie felt as though the floor had fallen away. Her mother wasn't Sarah Miller. She was Lillian Croft. Her father hadn't just found a lost girl. He had rescued a missing heiress. Her entire life, her identity, her very name, was a fabrication born of tragedy and love. She looked at Alexander. His face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. Profound grief for the sister he had lost and never truly known, awe at the miracle of her survival, and an overwhelming, heart-wrenching joy. Tears streamed freely down his face, unchecked. He wasn't a reclusive billionaire anymore. He was a man who had just found the last, living piece of his sister. He slowly rose from his chair and walked over to Sophie. He hesitated for a moment, then gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hello, Sophie," he whispered, his voice thick. "It's an honor to finally meet you." In that moment, she wasn't a waitress or an orphan. She was Sophie Miller Croft, and her life as she knew it was over. A new one, terrifying and unknown, was just beginning. The revelation in that quiet nursing home room did not just rewrite Sophie's past, it detonated her present. The journey back to New York was a surreal haze. She was no longer just Sophie, she was the living, breathing answer to a 22-year-old question. She was Lillian Croft's daughter. She was Alexander Croft's niece. The words felt foreign, like a costume she hadn't yet learned how to wear. Alexander, however, moved with the purpose of a man whose life had just been given a new, singular focus. The grief that had hollowed him out for years was being replaced by a fierce, protective energy directed entirely at Sophie and Eleanor. His first act was to orchestrate Eleanor's transfer from the pleasant but basic Maple Creek facility to a state-of-the-art private medical suite in New York City, with round-the-clock care from the very best doctors his fortune could procure. For the first time, Sophie saw the true, awesome power of his wealth, not as an abstraction, but as a tool for profound and immediate change. "She deserves the best," he said to Sophie, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "She protected you. She protected Lillian's legacy, even if she didn't know it. She is family." Sophie's own transition was more disorienting. Alexander's penthouse, which had at first felt like a temporary, if luxurious, shelter, was now presented as her home. A team of discreet staff appeared, along with lawyers and financial advisors, who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about trusts and inheritances that made Sophie's head spin. She went from worrying about a $2,000 dress to learning she was the sole heir to a significant portion of the Croft empire, a fortune that ran into the billions. It was overwhelming, and some nights she would retreat to her opulent bedroom with its panoramic city views and just hold the Phoenix pendant, the one constant in a life that had been turned upside down. It was no longer just a symbol of her mother's unknown past, but the tangible link between the simple life she had cherished and the extraordinary one that was now hers. One afternoon, about a week after their trip upstate, Alexander found her staring out the window, a pensive look on her face. "What are you thinking about?" he asked gently. Sophie turned, a small, wry smile on her lips. "The Gilded Sparrow," she admitted. "It seems like a lifetime ago. Mr. Peterson? Victoria Blackwood? It's strange. The worst night of my life was actually the beginning of my real life." A hard glint entered Alexander's eyes. It was a look she was coming to recognize. The look of the ruthless businessman who had built an empire from the ashes of his family's grief. "They have not been forgotten," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Some things require a personal touch. Would you do me the honor of accompanying me to dinner tonight?" A few hours later, Sophie found herself standing once again before the heavy oak doors of the Gilded Sparrow. This time, however, she wasn't in a worn polyester uniform. She was wearing a simple but exquisitely tailored midnight blue dress, a gift from Alexander. He stood beside her, a commanding presence in a dark suit. He hadn't made a reservation. He didn't need to. When they entered, the maitre d' rushed forward, his face a mixture of panic and awe. "Mr. Croft, we weren't expecting you. Please, right this way, your usual table." "My usual table will not be necessary," Alexander said, his voice cool and clear, carrying through the front of the restaurant. "We'll wait here." He and Sophie stood just inside the entryway, a silent, powerful tableau. And then they saw them. At a prime table near the front, the same one from that fateful night, sat Victoria Blackwood and her husband. And hovering over them, pouring wine with an obsequious smile, was Mr. Peterson. Peterson looked up, saw Alexander Croft, and his jaw went slack. His gaze then shifted to the woman beside him, and his face turned the color of chalk. He recognized Sophie. The transformation was so complete, it was disorienting. The timid, tear-stained waitress was gone, replaced by a composed, elegant woman who stood beside one of the most powerful men in the city. Victoria Blackwood, annoyed by the interruption, followed Peterson's gaze. Her eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in confusion. She let out a short, derisive laugh. Well, look what the cat dragged in. I'm surprised they let you through the door after your last performance. Did you come back to beg for your job?" she said, her voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Sophie felt a flicker of her old fear, but then she felt Alexander's steady presence beside her. She simply met Victoria's gaze, her expression unreadable. Alexander took a step forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet authority commanded the attention of the entire room. "Mr. Peterson," he said. Peterson scurried over, wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. "Mr. Croft, a pleasure. I had no idea." "On Monday of last week," Alexander continued as if giving a lecture, "a holding company under my direction, Croft Enterprises, finalized the acquisition of the entire restaurant group that owns the Gilded Sparrow and its 14 sister establishments across the country. As of this morning, I am your employer. Or rather, I was." Peterson's face crumpled. I don't understand." "You're fired," Alexander said, the words echoing Peterson's own from a week before, but carrying 1,000 times more weight. "For gross mismanagement and for a complete lack of basic human decency. Have your personal effects cleared out within the hour. Security will escort you." He then turned his cool gaze upon a stunned Victoria Blackwood. "Mrs. Blackwood, your behavior in this establishment has been noted. Your presence is an insult to the dedicated staff who work here. Your membership and that of your husband is permanently revoked. I suggest you finish your meal quickly. It will be your last." Victoria sat speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. The public humiliation, a weapon she had wielded so casually, was now turned upon her with devastating precision. Alexander then addressed the hushed restaurant. "My apologies for the interruption," he announced. "Allow me to introduce my niece, Sophie Miller Croft." He gently placed a hand on Sophie's back. "She is the daughter of my late sister, Lillian Croft, and she is the newest member of my board of directors. From now on, she will be taking a personal interest in ensuring that every employee under the Croft corporate umbrella is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." He looked down at Sophie, and for the first time in front of others, he smiled a genuine warm smile. The phoenix rises, Sophie. Sophie looked around the room at the stunned faces of the patrons, at the shocked but hopeful expressions of the waitstaff, at the utterly defeated figures of Peterson and Victoria. She felt the weight of her old life finally fall away, replaced not by the burden of wealth, but by the power of purpose. She wasn't just an heiress. She was her mother's daughter, her uncle's niece, and her grandmother's legacy of resilience. And she was finally ready to see what she could build from the ashes. The immediate aftermath of the revelation at the Gilded Sparrow was a whirlwind. The media, initially alerted by hushed whispers and then by Alexander's very public appearance with Sophie, descended like a flock of hungry birds. The story of the fired waitress who turned out to be the long-lost niece of billionaire Alexander Croft was irresistible. Tabloids screamed headlines, news channels ran endless segments, and the internet buzzed with speculation and manufactured drama. Alexander, a man who had spent his life meticulously guarding his privacy, found himself thrust back into the unwanted glare of the spotlight. But this time, he didn't retreat. He orchestrated a carefully managed press conference, introducing Sophie with a quiet dignity that spoke volumes. He confirmed the story, spoke briefly and emotionally about his sister Lillian, and emphasized his commitment to supporting Sophie as she navigated this new chapter of her life. Sophie, standing beside him, felt a strange mix of vulnerability and burgeoning confidence. The world was watching, judging, eager to dissect her every word and gesture. But she wasn't alone. The days that followed were a crash course in the life of the ultra-wealthy. Sophie was introduced to Alexander's vast business empire, attending meetings with sharp, impeccably dressed executives who treated her with a mixture of curiosity and deference. She learned about holding companies, investment portfolios, and philanthropic foundations, concepts that were light years away from balancing tips and nursing home bills. Alexander was a patient and surprisingly gentle guide, explaining the intricacies of his world without ever being condescending. He seemed determined to equip her with the knowledge and understanding she would need to navigate her new reality. One of the most significant adjustments was the constant presence of security. Mr. Reynolds assigned a discreet but ever-present detail to Sophie, a constant reminder of the potential dangers that came with wealth and public attention. Initially, Sophie chafed against this lack of freedom, but Alexander explained the necessity with a gravity that resonated. The world isn't always kind, Sophie, especially to those who suddenly find themselves in a position of power and wealth. This is for your protection and for Eleanor's. Speaking of Eleanor, her health had shown a remarkable improvement since being transferred to the private medical suite. The combination of expert medical care and the emotional relief of the long-held secret finally being out in the open seemed to have given her a new lease on life. Sophie spent a significant amount of time with her grandmother, listening to stories of her mother, Lillian now, the young, vibrant girl who had briefly found a safe harbor with them. These conversations filled in the missing pieces of Sophie's identity, painting a richer, more complete picture of the woman whose blood ran through her veins. Despite the comfort of Alexander's support in Eleanor's presence, Sophie often felt like an imposter in her new life. She missed the simple routines of her old existence, the camaraderie of her former colleagues, most of whom had reached out with heartfelt messages of support, and the quiet anonymity of being just another face in the city. The opulent surroundings sometimes felt suffocating, the endless choices overwhelming. One evening, Alexander found her in the Croft family library, a vast room lined with leather-bound books, looking lost amidst the grandeur. She was holding a worn paperback, a book of poetry she had picked up from a used bookstore years ago. "Everything all right, Sophie?" he asked, his voice soft. Sophie looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. "Yes, fine. Just, remembering things. This used to be my escape." She held up the book. "Now, I don't know what is." Alexander sat down in the armchair opposite hers. "It takes time to adjust to such a big change. Don't feel like you have to abandon the things you loved about your old life. They are still a part of who you are." "But who am I?" Sophie asked, the question hanging in the air between them. "Am I Sophie Miller, the waitress, or Sophie Croft, the heiress?" Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life. Alexander nodded, understanding in his eyes. You are both, Sophie. You are the woman who worked hard and cared for her grandmother, and you are the daughter of Lillian Croft. Neither of those things negates the other. Embrace all of it. Your experiences have made you who you are. Your strength, your empathy, your resilience. Those are qualities that wealth can't buy. He paused, then added, Lillian, she was a fighter. Even before the accident, she had a spirit that wouldn't be broken. I see that same spirit in you, Sophie. His words were a comfort, a lifeline in the sea of uncertainty. Sophie realized that she didn't have to choose between her past and her present. She could weave them together, creating a new tapestry of her own design. In the weeks that followed, Sophie began to find her footing. She started learning more about the Croft Foundation, Alexander's philanthropic arm, and discovered a passion for their work in supporting educational initiatives for underprivileged youth. It felt like a way to use her newfound position to make a tangible difference in the world, a way to honor the struggles she had overcome. She also made a point of connecting with the former staff of the Gilded Sparrow. Alexander had ensured that all employees who had not been complicit in Peterson's actions were not only retained under the new management, but also received better pay and benefits. Sophie visited the restaurant, now under a new, more compassionate manager, and spoke with the staff, listening to their concerns and offering her support. It was a small way of acknowledging her past and showing that she hadn't forgotten where she came from. One afternoon, Alexander called her into his office. He sat behind his large mahogany desk, but his usual air of formal authority was softened by a hint of nervousness. Sophie, he began, there's something I wanted to give you, something that belonged to Lillian. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it and slid it across the desk towards her. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was another silver phoenix pendant. It was identical to the one Sophie had, down to the tiny sapphire eye. Lillian was wearing hers when the boat went down, Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. It was never recovered. After we had the memorial, my father commissioned a replica. He wanted me to have it, a reminder of her. But it's always felt incomplete without her. He looked at Sophie, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. Now there are two again, two phoenixes, a symbol of our family, of rising from the ashes together. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes. She carefully picked up the pendant, its weight familiar and comforting in her hand. It was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a tangible link to the sister she had never known, a symbol of the family she had unexpectedly found. Thank you, Alexander, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He stood up and came around the desk, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. We have a lot to learn about each other, Sophie, but we'll do it together. We're family now. As Sophie looked at the two identical phoenix pendants in her hands, a sense of peace settled over her. The whirlwind of the past few weeks hadn't erased her past. It had expanded it. She was still Sophie Miller, the resilient young woman who had faced hardship with courage. But now she was also Sophie Croft, part of a family with a history of both tragedy and enduring love. The phoenix, the symbol of rising from the ashes, felt more meaningful than ever. Her life had been forged in the flames of adversity, but now, with her newfound family and a future full of possibilities, she was finally ready to spread her wings and truly fly. The journey into this new world wouldn't be easy, but she knew she wasn't alone. The phoenix had risen, and so had she. From the ashes of a cruel dismissal, a life was reborn. Sophie Miller's story isn't just about a twist of fate. It's a powerful testament to the idea that our true worth is not defined by our job title or our bank account, but by the integrity and kindness we carry within us. A simple pendant, a symbol of resilience passed down through generations, became the key that unlocked a hidden past and forged an unimaginable future. It proves that even in our darkest moments, a connection can be made, a truth can be revealed, and a life can be changed forever. The world may have seen a poor waitress, but fate and a long-lost uncle saw the heiress she was always meant to be. If this incredible story of loss, discovery, and ultimate justice moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who needs a dose of hope, and subscribing for more real-life dramas that will leave you breathless. What was the most shocking twist for you? Let us know in the comments below.